Good evening and welcome. Tonight I'm going to be reading to you from this book. It's Delaire's Book of Greek Myths. And I'm very excited for this because I had this book when I was little and I loved it. And I went through that Greek gods phase where I just thought that they were the coolest things ever. And this book was a big part of that. So tonight I'm going to be reading to you about the Greek gods, their origins, and a little more about them. I'll show you the table of contents here. This is a really cool book. If you've never read it before, you should really check it out because it has all of this information about the gods. That's what we're going to read tonight. Then lots of stuff about minor gods, and then lots of myths from Greek mythology, some of the best ones, Heracles, Oedipus, Jason and the Argonauts, all the good ones, King Midas, Sisyphus, all the exciting ones. So today we're just going to focus on the gods, but I encourage you, if you've never heard of these names, to find a book or a book like this and learn more about these stories because they're excellent. So let's just dive right in and get started. We start off with this map of mythological Greece. It pinpoints all of the places of note in ancient Greece and in the stories. You can see Heracles was born here. And let's see where else. Oh, Thrace up here, the wild land of Eris. And most of our setting is going to be in Mount Olympus, which you see right here, the home of the gods. But we'll hear about Athens and maybe a few other places around Greece. But let's just dive right in. Oh yeah, we'll hear about Crete as well down here. Sorry for the noise. Let's go. So, in olden times, when men still worshipped ugly idols, there lived in the land of Greece a folk of shepherds and herdsmen who cherished light and beauty. They did not worship dark idols like their neighbors, but created instead their own beautiful, radiant gods. The Greek gods looked much like people and acted like them too, only they were taller, handsomer, and could do no wrong. Fire-breathing monsters and beasts with many heads stood for all that was dark and wicked. They were for gods and great heroes to conquer. The gods lived on top of Olympus, a mountain so high and steep that no man could climb it and see them in their shining palace. But they often descended to earth, sometimes in their own shapes, sometimes disguised as humans or animals. Mortals worshipped the gods, and the gods honored Mother Earth. They all had sprung from her, for she was the beginning of all life. I'll let you look at the pretty picture while I read to you. See Olympus up here. Gaia, the Earth, came out of darkness so long ago that nobody knows when or how. Earth was young and lonesome, for nothing lived on her yet. Above her rose Uranus, the sky, dark and blue, set all over with sparkling stars. He was magnificent to behold, and young Earth looked up at him and fell in love with him. Sky smiled down at Earth, twinkling with his countless stars, and they were joined in love. Soon young Earth became Mother Earth, the mother of all things living. All her children loved her all the children loved their warm and bountiful mother, and feared their mighty father Uranus, Lord of the universe. The Titans. The Titans were the first children of Mother Earth. They were the first gods, taller than the mountain she created to serve them as thrones, and both earth and sky were proud of them. There were 6 Titans, 6 glorious gods, and they had 6 sisters, the Titanesses, whom they took for their wives. When Gaia again gave birth, Uranus was not proud. Their new children were also huge, but each one had one glowing eye set in the middle of their forehead. They were the three Cyclopes, and they were named Lightning, Thunder, and Thunderbolt. They were not handsome gods, but tremendously strong smiths. Sparks from their heavy hammers flashed across the sky and lit up the heavens so brightly that even their father's stars faded. After a while, Mother Earth bore 3 more sons. Uranus looked at them with disgust. Each of them had 50 heads and 100 strong arms. He hated to see such ugly creatures that walk about on lovely earth. So he seized them and their brothers the Cyclopes and flung them into Tartarus, the deepest, darkest pit under the earth. Mother Earth loved her children and could not forgive her husband for his cruelty to them. Out of hardest flint she fastened a sickle and spoke to her sons the Titans. "Take this weapon, make an end to your father's cruelty, and set your brothers free." Fear took hold of 5 of the Titans, and they trembled and refused. Only Cronus, the youngest but the strongest, dared to take the sickle. He fell upon his father. Uranus could not withstand the weapon wielded by his strong son, and he fled, giving up his powers. Mother Earth made Pontus, the boundless seas, her second husband, and from this union sprang the gods of the watery depths. And from her rich ground grew an abundance of trees and flowers, and out of her crevices sprites, beasts, and early man crept forth. Cronus was now Lord of the universe. He sat on the highest mountain and ruled over heaven and earth with a firm hand. The other gods obeyed his will, and early man worshipped him. This was man's golden age. Men lived happily and in peace with the gods and each other. They did not kill, and they had no locks on their doors, for theft had not been yet invented. But Cronus did not set his monstrous brothers free, and Mother Earth was angry with him and plotted his downfall. She had to wait, for no god yet born was strong enough to oppose him. But she knew that one of his sons would be stronger than he, just as Cronus had been stronger than his father. Cronus knew it too. So every time his Titaness wife Rhea gave birth, he took the newborn god and swallowed it. With all of his offspring securely inside him, he had nothing to fear. But Rhea mourned. Her 5 sisters, who had married the 5 other Titans, were surrounded by their Titan children, while she was all alone. When Rhea expected her 6th child, she asked Mother Earth to help her save the child from his father. That was just what Mother Earth had been waiting for. She gave her daughter whispered advice, and Rhea went away smiling. As soon as Rhea had borne her child, the god Zeus, she hid him. Then she wrapped a stone in baby clothes and gave it to her husband to swallow instead of her son. Cronus was fooled and swallowed the stone, and the little god Zeus was spirited away to a secret cave on the island of Crete. Old Cronus never heard the cries of his young son, for Mother Earth set noisy earth sprites outside the cave. They made such a clatter, beating their shields with their swords, that other sounds were drowned out. Zeus and his family. Zeus was tended by gentle nymphs and was nursed by the fairy goat Amalthea. From the horns of the goat flowed ambrosia and nectar, the food and drink of the gods. Zeus grew rapidly, and it was not long before he strode out of the cave as a great new god. To thank the nymphs for tending him so well, he gave them the horns of the goat. They were horns of plenty and could never be emptied. From the hide of the goat he made for himself an impenetrable breastplate, the Aegis, and now he was so strong that Cronus could do nothing against him. Young Zeus chose Metis, a Titan's daughter, for his first wife. She was the goddess of prudence, and he needed her good advice. She warned him not to try alone to overthrow his child-devouring father, for Cronus had all the other Titans and their sons on his side. First, Zeus must also have strong allies. Metis went to Cronus and cunningly tricked him into eating a magic herb. He thought that the herb would make him unconquerable. Instead, it made him so sick that he vomited up not only the stone he had swallowed, but his 5 other children as well. They were the gods Hades and Poseidon, and the goddesses Hestia, Demeter, and Hera, all mighty gods who right away joined forces with Zeus. When Cronus saw the 6 young gods rising against him, he knew that his hour had come, and he surrendered his powers and fled. Now Zeus was the lord of the universe. He did not want to rule alone. He shared his powers with his brothers and sisters, but the Titans and their sons revolted. They refused to let themselves be ruled by the new gods. Only Prometheus and his brother Epimetheus left the Titans to join Zeus, for Prometheus could look into the future, and he knew that Zeus would win. Zeus freed the monstrous sons of Mother Earth from Tartarus. Gratefully, the 100 armed ones fought for him with all their strength, and the Cyclopes forged mighty weapons for him and his brothers. They made a trident for Poseidon. It was so forceful that when he struck the ground with it, the earth shook, and when he struck the sea, frothing waves stood mountain high. For Hades, they made a cap of invisibility so he could strike his enemies unseen, and for Zeus they forged lightning bolts. Armed with them, he was the mightiest god of them all. Nothing could stand against him and his thunderbolts. The Titans fought a bitter battle, but at last they had to surrender, and Zeus locked them up in Tartarus. The 100 armed monsters went to stand guard at the gates to see that they never escaped. Atlas, the strongest of the Titans, was sent to the end of the world to carry forever the vault of the sky on his shoulders. Angry with Zeus for sending her sons, the Titans, into the dark pit of Tartarus, Mother Earth now brought forth 2 terrible monsters, Typhon and his mate Echidna, and set them against Zeus. They were so fearful that when the gods saw them, they changed themselves into animals and fled in terror. Typhon's 100 horrible heads touched the stars, venom dripped from his evil eyes, and lava and red-hot stones poured from his gaping mouths. Hissing like 100 snakes and roaring like 100 lions, he tore up whole mountains and threw them at the gods. Zeus soon regained his courage and turned, and when the other gods saw him taking his stand, they came back to help him fight the monster. A terrible battle raged, and hardly a living creature was left on earth. But Zeus was fated to win, and as Typhon tore up huge Mount Etna to hurl at the gods, Zeus struck it with 100 well-aimed thunderbolts, and the mountain fell back, pinning Typhon underneath. There the monster lies to this very day, belching fire, lava, and smoke through the top of the mountain. Echidna, his hideous mate, escaped destruction. She cowered in a cave, protecting Typhon's dreadful offspring, and Zeus let them live as a challenge to future heroes. There's the Nemean lion, Cerberus, Ladon, Chimera, Sphinx, and Hydra. Now at last Mother Earth gave up her struggle. There were no more upheavals, and the wounds of the war soon healed. The mountains stood firmly anchored, the seas had their shores, the rivers had their riverbeds, and ox-horned river gods watched over them, and each tree and each spring had its nymph. The earth again was green and fruitful, and Zeus could begin to rule in peace. The one-eyed Cyclopes were not only smiths, but masons as well, and they built a towering palace for the gods on top of Mount Olympus, the highest mountain in Greece. The palace was hidden in clouds, and the goddesses of the seasons rolled them away whenever a god wanted to go down to earth. Nobody else could pass through the gate of clouds. Iris, the fleet-footed messenger of the gods, had her own path down to earth. Dressed in a gown of iridescent drops, she ran along the rainbow on her busy errands between Olympus and Earth. In the gleaming hall of the palace, where light never failed, The Olympian gods sat on 12 gold thrones and reigned over heaven and earth. There were 12 great gods, but with 6 of his children and the goddess of love as well. Zeus himself sat on the highest throne, with a bucket full of thunderbolts beside him. On his right sat his youngest sister Hera, whom he had chosen from all his wives as his queen. Beside her sat her son Ares, god of war, and Hephaestus, god of fire, with Aphrodite, the goddess of love, between them. Next was Zeus's son Hermes, the herald of the gods, and Zeus's sister Demeter, goddess of the harvest, with her daughter Persephone on her lap. On the left of Zeus sat his brother Poseidon, the lord of the sea. Next to him sat the 4 children of Zeus: Athena, the twins Apollo and Artemis, and Dionysus, the youngest of the gods. Athena was the goddess of wisdom, Apollo, the god of light and music, Artemis, goddess of the hunt, and Dionysus, the god of wine. Hestia, the eldest sister of Zeus, was goddess of the hearth. She had no throne, but tended the sacred fire in the hall, and every hearth on earth was her altar. She was the gentlest of all the Olympians. Hades, the eldest brother of Zeus, was the lord of the dead. He preferred to stay in his gloomy palace in the underworld and never went to Olympus. The gods themselves could not die, for divine ichor flowed in their veins instead of blood. Most of the time they lived happily together, feasting on sweet-smelling ambrosia and nectar. But when their wills clashed, there were violent quarrels. Then Zeus would reach for a thunderbolt, and the Olympians would tremble and fall to order, for Zeus alone was stronger than all the other gods together. Hera, the beautiful queen of Olympus, was a very jealous wife. Even Zeus, who was afraid of nothing, feared her fits of temper. She hated all his other wives, and when Zeus first asked her to be his wife, she refused. Slyly, Zeus created a thunderstorm, changed himself into a little cuckoo, and pretending to be in distress, he flew into Hera's arms for protection. She pitied the wet little bird and hugged it close to keep it warm, but all of a sudden she found herself holding mighty Zeus in her arms instead of the bird. Thus Zeus won Hera, and all nature burst into bloom for their wedding. Mother Earth gave the bride a little apple tree that bore golden apples of immortality. Hera treasured the tree and planted it in the garden of Hesperides, her secret garden far to the west. She put 100-headed dragon under the tree to guard the apples, and ordered her 3 nymphs of the Hesperides to water and care for the tree. Zeus loved Hera dearly, but he was also very fond of rocky Greece. He often sneaked down to earth in disguise to marry mortal girls. The more wives he had, the more children he would have, and all the better for Greece. All his children would inherit some of his greatness and become great heroes and rulers. But Hera, in her jealous rage, tormented his other wives and children, and even Zeus was powerless to stop her. She knew how tricky Zeus could be and kept a very close watch over him. One day as Hera looked down on earth, she spied a small dark thundercloud where no cloud should have been. She rushed down and darted into the cloud. Zeus was there just as she had suspected, but with him was only a little snow-white cow. He had seen Hera coming, and to protect his newest bride, Io, from her wrath, he had changed the girl into a cow. Alas, the cow was as lovely as the girl, and Hera was not deceived, but she pretended to suspect nothing and begged Zeus to let her have the dainty cow. Zeus could not well refuse his queen such a little wish without giving himself away, and he had to give her the cow. Hera tied poor Io to a tree and sent her servant Argus to watch over her. Argus had 100 bright eyes placed all over his body. He was so big and strong that single-handedly he made an end to the monstrous echidna who had lived in a cave and had devoured all who passed by. He was Hera's faithful servant and the best of watchmen, for he never closed more than half of his eyes in sleep at a time. Argus sat down next to the cow and watched her with all his eyes, and poor Io had to walk on 4 legs and eat grass. She raised her mournful eyes to Olympus, but Zeus was so afraid of Hera that he did not dare to help her. At last he could no longer bear to see her distress, and he asked his son Hermes, the craftiest of the gods, to run down to earth and set Io free. Hermes disguised himself as a shepherd and walked up to Argus playing a tune on his shepherd's pipe. Argus was bored, having nothing to do with all his eyes but watch a little cow, and he was glad to have music and company. Hermes sat down beside him, and after he had played for a while, he began to tell a long and dull story. It had no beginning and it had no end, and 50 of Argus's eyes closed in sleep. Hermes droned on, and slowly the 50 other eyes fell shut, one by one. Quickly Hermes touched all the eyes with his magic wand and closed them forever in eternal sleep. Argus had been bored to death. Hermes then untied the cow, and Io ran home to her father, the river god Inachus. He did not recognize the cow as his daughter, but Io could not tell him what had happened. All she could say was moo. But when she lifted up her little hoof and scratched her name, I-O, in the river sand, her father at once understood what had happened, for he knew the ways of Zeus. The cat's snoring. Inachus rose out of his riverbed and rushed off to take revenge on the mighty thunder god. He flew at Zeus in such a rage that to save himself, Zeus had to throw a thunderbolt, and ever since the bed of the river Inachus in Arcadia has been dry. Hera was furious when she saw that Argus was dead and the cow Io had been set free. She sent a vicious gadfly to sting and chase the cow. To be sure that her faithful servant Argus would never be forgotten, she took his 100 bright eyes and put them in the tail of the peacock, her favorite bird. The eyes could no longer see, but they looked gorgeous, and that went to the peacock's little head and made it the vainest of all animals. Pursued by the gadfly, Io ran all over Greece. Trying to escape from its tormenting sting, she jumped across the strait that separates Europe from Asia Minor, and ever since it has been called the Bosporus, the cow ford. But still the gadfly chased her all the way to the land of Egypt. When the Egyptians saw the snow-white cow, they fell to their knees and worshipped her. She became an Egyptian goddess, and Hera now permitted Zeus to change her back to her human shape. But first he had to promise never to look at Io again. Io lived long as the goddess queen of Egypt, and the son she bore to Zeus became king after her. Her descendants returned to Greece as great kings and beautiful queens. Poor Io's sufferings had not all been in vain. Hephaestus, the god of smiths and fire, was the son of Zeus and Hera. He was a hard-working, peace-loving god, and was very fond of his mother. Often he tried to soothe her temper with gentle words. Once he had even dared to step between his quarreling parents. He sided with Hera, and that made Zeus so angry that he seized his son by the legs and flung him out of Olympus. For a whole day Hephaestus hurtled through the air. In the evening he fell on the island of Lemnos with a thump so hard that the island shook. Thetis, the gentle sea goddess, found him all broken and bruised. She bound his wounds and nursed him back to health. Zeus forgave him, and Hephaestus returned to Olympus, but ever after he walked like a flickering flame. His body was big and strong, and his hands were wonderfully skilled. But his weak legs could not support him for long. He built himself 2 robots of gold and silver to help him about. They had mechanical brains and could think for themselves. They even could speak with their tongues of silver. They also served him as helpers in his workshop on Olympus. It was there that Hephaestus made the 12 golden thrones of the gods and their marvelous weapons, chariots, and jewels. He also had forges inside volcanoes on Earth. His helpers were the one-eyed Cyclopes. They worked his bellows and swung his heavy hammers. When Hephaestus was at work, the din of the hammers could be heard for miles, and sparks flew out of the tops of the mountains. All the Olympian gods were fond of Hephaestus and often went to his forge to admire his work. When Aphrodite, his lovely wife, came to his workshop to look at the matchless jewels he was fashioning for her, she daintily lifted her trailing garments out of the soot. Aphrodite, the beautiful goddess of love, was the only Olympian who had neither mother nor father. Nobody knew from where she had come. The west wind had first seen her in the pearly light of dawn as she rose out of the sea on a cushion of foam. Where's the dawn? She floated lightly over the gentle waves and was so lovely to behold that the wind almost lost his breath. With soft puffs he blew her to the flowering island of Cythera, where the three Graces welcomed her ashore. The three Graces, goddesses of beauty, became her attendants. They dressed her in shimmering garments, bedecked her with sparkling jewels, and placed her in a golden chariot drawn by white doves. There it is. Then they led her to Olympus, where all the gods rejoiced in her beauty, seated her on a golden throne, and made her one of them. Zeus was afraid that the gods would fight over the hand of Aphrodite, and to prevent it he quickly chose a husband for her. He gave her to Hephaestus, the steadiest of the gods, and he, who could hardly believe his good luck, used all his skill to make the most lavish jewels for her. He made her a girdle of finely wrought gold and wove magic into the filigree work. That was not very wise of him, for when she wore her magic girdle no one could resist her, and she was all too irresistible already. Aphrodite had a mischievous little son, whose name was Eros. He darted about with a bow and a quiver full of arrows. They were arrows of love, and he delighted in shooting them into the hearts of unwary victims. Whoever was hit by one of his arrows fell head over heels in love with the first person he saw, while Eros laughed mockingly. Once a year, Aphrodite returned to Cythera and dived into the sea from which she had come. Sparkling and young, she rose from the water, as dewy fresh as on the day when she had first been seen. She loved gaiety and glamour, and was not at all pleased at being the wife of city hard-working Hephaestus. She would rather have had his brother Ares for her husband. Ares, the god of war, was tall and handsome but vain, and as cruel as his brother Hephaestus was kind. Eris, the spirit of strife, was his constant companion. Eris was sinister and mean, and her greatest joy was to make trouble. She had a golden apple that was so bright and shiny, everybody wanted to have it. When she threw it among friends, their friendship came to a rapid end. When she threw it among enemies, war broke out, for the golden apple of Eris was an apple of discord. When Ares heard the clashing of arms, he grinned with glee, put on his gleaming helmet, and leapt into his war chariot. Brandishing his sword like a torch, he rushed into the thick of battle, not caring who won or lost as long as much blood was shed. A vicious crowd followed at his heels, carrying with them pain, panic, famine, and oblivion. That's pain, panic, famine, oblivion. There we go. Once in a while, Ares himself was wounded. He was immortal, but he could not bear to suffer pain and screamed so loudly that he could be heard for miles. Then he would run home to Olympus, where Zeus in disgust called him the worst of his children and told him to stop his howling. His wounds, treated with the ointment of the gods, quickly healed, and Ares returned as good as ever and seated himself on his throne, tall, handsome, and boastful, the plume on his golden helmet nodding proudly. Aphrodite admired him for his splendid looks, but none of the other gods were fond of him, least of all his half-sister Athena. She loathed his vain strutting and senseless bloodshed. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, was the favorite child of Zeus. She had sprung fully grown out of her father's head. Her mother was Metis, goddess of prudence, the first wife of Zeus. He depended on her, for he needed her wise counsel, but Mother Earth warned him that were Metis to bear her a son, this son would dethrone him as Zeus had dethroned Cronus, his father, who had dethroned his own father Uranus. This must not happen, thought Zeus, but he could not do without her advice, so he decided to swallow her. Slyly, he proposed that they play a game of changing shapes, and Metis, forgetting her prudence, playfully turned herself into all kinds of animals, big and small. Just as she had taken on the shape of a little fly, Zeus opened wide his mouth, took a deep breath, and zip, he swallowed the fly. Ever after, Metis sat in his head and guided him from there. Now it happened that Metis was going to have a daughter, and she sat inside Zeus's head, hammering out a helmet and weaving a splendid robe for the coming child. Soon Zeus began to suffer from pounding headaches and cried out in agony. All the gods came running to help him, and skilled Hephaestus grabbed his tools and split open his father's skull. Out sprang Athena, wearing the robe and helmet, her gray eyes flashing. Thunder roared, and the gods stood in awe. Athena's constant companion was Nike, the spirit of victory. With Nike at her side, Athena led armies, but only those that fought for just causes. In time of peace, she stood behind the artists of Greece and taught them the fine and useful arts. She had great pride in her own skills at the loom and the potter's wheel, but was happy to see her pupils excel as long as they showed her proper respect. One of her pupils was Arachne, a simple country girl who was wonderfully skilled at the loom. People came from far and wide to admire her weavings. Stupidly, she boasted that she had learned nothing from Athena, indeed that she was better than the goddess. That hurt Athena's pride. Disguised as an old woman, she went to the girl and tried to talk sense into her. "Your work is beautiful," she said, "but why compare yourself with the gods? Why not be contented to be the best among mortals? Let the goddess Athena herself come and measure her skill against mine," Arachne answered haughtily. Angrily, Athena threw off her disguise and stood before the girl in all her glory. "Vain girl," she said, "you may have your wish. Sit down at your loom and let us compete." Athena wove the most beautiful tapestry ever seen. Every thread and knot was perfect, and the colors sparkled. It pictured the Olympian Gods in all their glory and majesty. Arachne's tapestry was beautifully woven. Athena herself had to admit that the girl's craftsmanship was flawless. But what kind of a picture had she woven? An irreverent scene making fun of Zeus and his wives. In a wrath, the goddess tore the tapestry to shreds and struck the girl with the shuttle. Immediately, Arachne felt her head shrink almost to nothing. Her nimble fingers changed into long, spindly legs. Athena had turned her into a spider. "Vainglorious girl, go on and spin your thread and weave your empty net forever," said Athena to Arachne the spider. Athena was a just goddess, and she could be very stern. She knew that the gods were great only as long as they were properly worshipped by mortals. Athena was very fond of a certain city in Greece, and so was her uncle Poseidon. Both of them claimed the city, and after a long quarrel they decided that the one who could give it the finest gift should have it. Leading a procession of citizens, the two gods mounted the Acropolis, the flat-topped rock that crowned the city. Poseidon struck the cliff with his trident, and a spring welled up. The people marveled, but the water was salty as the sea that Poseidon ruled, and not very useful. Then Athena gave the city her gift. She planted an olive tree in a crevice on the rock. It was the first olive tree the people had ever seen. Athena's gift was judged the better of the two, for it gave food, oil, and wood, and the city was hers. From her beautiful temple on top of the Acropolis, Athena watched over Athens, her city, with the wise owl, her bird, on her shoulder, and under her leadership the Athenians grew famous for their arts and crafts. Poseidon, lord of the sea, was a moody and violent god. His fierce blue eyes pierced the haze, and his sea blue hair streamed out behind him. He was called the Earth Shaker, for when he struck the ground with his trident, the earth trembled and split open. When he struck the sea, waves rose mountain high and winds howled, wrecking ships and drowning those who lived on the shores. But when he was in a calm mood, he would stretch out his hand and still the sea and raise new lands out of the water. In the days of Cronus and the Titans, the sea was ruled by Nereus, son of Mother Earth and Pontus the seas. Nereus was an old sea god with a long gray beard and a fish tail, and was the father of 50 sea nymphs, the lovely Nereids. With Poseidon, the Olympian, when Poseidon, the Olympian, came to take over the kingdom of the sea, kind old Nereus gave him his daughter Aphrodite for his queen, and retired to an underwater grotto. He gave the new king and queen his palace at the bottom of the sea. It was made of the palest gold and lay in a garden of corals and shimmering pearls. There, Aphrodite lived contentedly surrounded by her 49 Nereid sisters. She had an only son whose name was Triton. He had a fish tail instead of legs, like his grandfather Nereus, and rode about on the back of a sea monster, trumpeting on a conch shell. Poseidon was rarely at home. He was a restless god and loved to race the waves with his team of snow-white horses. It was said that he had created the horse in the shape of breaking waves. Like his brother Zeus, Poseidon had many wives and children, but Aphrodite was not jealous like Hera. One of the islands that Poseidon raised out of the sea was Delos. It was so newly created that it was still floating about on the water. The little island was barren. Nothing grew on it yet except a single palm tree. In its shade, the two great gods Apollo and Artemis were to be born. Zeus had married the goddess Leto, and when Hera found out that Leto was expecting twins, she flew into a jealous rage and ordered all the lands in the world to refuse Leto's shelter. Chased away from every land, poor Leto wandered from place to place and could not rest to give birth to her twins. At last she came to Delos, and the little island welcomed her. Since it was still floating and not quite land, it was free from Hera's bidding. Exhausted, Leto sank down in the shade of the palm tree, but still she could not give birth to her twins, for Hera forbade Eilithyia, the goddess of childbirth, to go to her. Without her help, no child could be born. All the other goddesses felt sorry for Leto and tried to sway Hera by offering her a beautiful necklace. It was 9 yards long, made of gold and amber, and Hera could not resist it. She let Eilithyia go, and Iris whisked her down the rainbow to Leto. Leto's first child was Artemis, a girl as beautiful as the moon, with hair as dark as the night. She was to be the goddess of the hunt and all newborn creatures. Then Apollo came into the world. He was fair as the sun, and he was to be the god of music, light, and reason. Zeus was filled with joy at the sight of his beautiful twins, and he gave them each a silver bow and a quiver full of arrows. The arrows of Artemis were soft as moonbeams and brought painless death. Those of Apollo were hard and piercing as the rays of the sun. Zeus blessed the little island and fastened it to the bottom of the sea. Grass and flowers burst forth from the barren ground, and Delos became the richest of all the Greek islands. Pilgrims flocked to it and loaded it with temples and treasures to honor Leto and her twins. Apollo grew rapidly, as all gods did, and when he was full grown, Zeus sent him off in a chariot drawn by white swans to win for himself the Oracle of Delphi. No place in Greece was as sacred as Delphi on the steep slopes of Mount Parnassus. Sulphurous fumes rose from the deep cleft cliff to the mountainside. A Sibyl, the priestess of Delphi, sat on a tripod over the cleft, and the vapors put her into a magic sleep. In her dreams, the Sibyl heard the voice of Mother Earth coming up from the depths, and repeated the mystic words she heard. Priests stood about the Sibyl and explained the meanings of her muttered prophecies to the pilgrims who had come to the Oracle of Delphi to learn about their future. The oracle was guarded by the darksome dragon Typhon, who lay coiled around the sacred place. Old age had made him mean and so ill-tempered that the nymphs fled from the sacred spring nearby, and the birds no longer dared to sing in the trees. The oracle had warned Python that Leto's son would one day destroy him. He had tried to devour Leto, and she wandered about looking for a place to give birth to her children, but she had escaped. When the old black dragon saw radiant Apollo flying toward him in his golden chariot, he knew that his last hour had come. But he sold his life dearly. He unleashed his fury, spitting fire and venom, and his black scaly body did not stop writhing and coiling until Apollo shot him with 1,000 of his silver shafts. In torrents did the dragon's venom flow down the mountainside, and the oracle of Delphi was Apollo's. Now there was light and joy on the once somber slopes of Mount Parnassus. The air was filled with sweet tunes as the birds in the sky and the nymphs of the sacred spring returned to sing Apollo's praise. The voice of the young god rose above all the others, for he was also the god of music. Artemis, as a newborn goddess, went to her father Zeus and asked him to grant her a wish. She wanted to remain forever a wild young maiden hunting through the woods, and she asked him to promise never to make her marry. Zeus consented, and then she asked him for 50 fleet nymphs as companions and a pack of lop-eared hounds to hunt with. Her father gave her all she asked, and she herself caught 4 hinds with golden antlers and harnessed them to her silver chariot. When the moon's magic light shone over echoing hills and wooded valleys, Artemis hunted with the nymphs and her hounds. After a wild hunt, the goddess loved to bathe in a quiet pool. Woe to the mortal who happened to see her then. One night, quite by chance, a young hunter whose name was Actaeon came upon the pool in the woods where Artemis and her nymphs were bathing. He should have taken to his heels and run for his life, but instead he stood spellbound by the sight of the goddess. Artemis was furious. While the nymphs flung a tunic over her shoulders, the goddess dipped her hand into the pool and threw a handful of water at Actaeon. The moment the silvery drops touched his forehead, his antlers sprouted, and rapidly all of Actaeon changed into a stag. His own hounds leaped at him, and to his horror, he could not utter a human sound to call them off. They brought him down, never knowing that the deer was their own master. No mortal shall live to boast that he has seen Artemis bathing, said the goddess, and she picked up her bow and arrows and went on hunting with her nymphs. Artemis was a cold and pitiless goddess. Apollo and Artemis, though different as day and night, were very fond of each other, and they both adored their mother. No one could say a belittling word about gentle Leto without arousing the wrath of her twins. There was a queen of Thebes whose name was Niobe. She was beautiful, and she was rich, and she was blessed with 14 children. Zeus himself was her grandfather, and she was very proud. "Why worship Leto?" she said to her people. "Build me a temple and worship me in her stead. I have 7 sons and 7 daughters, while she has only 1 of each." When Apollo and Artemis heard this, they grew very angry. Niobe's disrespect could not go unpunished. Apollo shot his hard arrows at Niobe's 7 sons. By no fault of their own, they were torn from life in their prime of their youth. When Artemis let fly her painless shafts at the 7 daughters, then Artemis let quietly they lay down on their beds and died. Niobe's proud heart was broken. She wept for so long that the gods at last took pity on her and changed her into an unfeeling rock. Still inside the rock, a spring welled up and water like tears trickled down the face of the hard stone. Apollo had many wives, but Zeus kept his promise to Artemis and never made her marry. Only once she promised her hand to a suitor, but that was a promise she had no intention of keeping. The suitor was Otis, a gigantic son of Poseidon. Otis and his brother Ephialtes were almost 60 feet tall when they reached manhood, and still they went on growing. The gods watched them with concern, for an oracle had predicted that neither gods nor mortals could kill the giant brothers. Mother Earth, however, watched them with pleasure. She was still angry with Zeus for keeping her sons, the Titans and Tartarus, and she hoped that Otis and Ephialtes would grow big enough to overthrow him. One night, as the brothers slept with their ears to the ground, they heard Mother Earth whisper that such tall and handsome youths should not let themselves be ruled by Zeus. That was just what they had been thinking themselves, for they were vain, as many strong people are. They pulled up mountains, piled them on top of each other, and built a vast new mountain as high as Olympus. From the top they called to Zeus to surrender his powers to them and move out of his palace with the other Olympians. Artemis could stay and become his bride, shouted Otis, and Ephialtes would take Hera. The two goddesses tossed their heads with scorn, and Zeus in a fury hurled thunderbolts at the ruffians. Zeus's thunderbolts glanced off harmlessly, and when Ares rushed on to fight them, they grabbed him and crammed him into a bronze jar, clamped the lid shut. For once Zeus was really worried, but Apollo, the god of reason, said that if no one could kill them, they must be tricked into killing each other. He persuaded Artemis to pretend that she was in love with Otis. Otis smirked when Apollo called to him that Artemis thought so much of him that she had accepted his proposal and would wait for him on the island of Naxos. That made Ephialtes jealous. Why hadn't Hera fallen in love with him? Wasn't he as handsome as his brother? But he swallowed his pride and went to Naxos with his brother to meet the bride. When Artemis saw the two brothers arriving, she quickly changed herself into a white deer and ran across their path. She darted to and fro between them and the brothers, who were eager huntsmen, threw their javelins at the deer. Cleverly she dodged, and the brothers fell to the ground, pierced by each other's javelins. Neither gods nor mortals could kill the giant brothers, but now they had put an end to each other, and were thrown into Tartarus, tied back to back with writhing snakes. All the gods thanked Artemis for saving them, and pulled Ares out of the jar where he had been crouching all the while, howling and screaming. Orion was another giant son of Poseidon, but unlike Otis and Ephialtes, he was modest. He was a great hunter. No beast could escape from his club and jeweled sword, but he never forgot to praise Artemis as the greatest of all hunters. One day, Orion, who could walk on water as if it were land, came to the island of Chios. The island was infested with lions, wolves, and boars who roared and howled so loudly at night that the king of Chios could not sleep. He promised Orion the hand of his daughter if he could rid the island of all the wild beasts. The king's daughter was beautiful, her father's greatest treasure, and Orion hunted as never before. Soon there was not a wild beast left, but the king did not want to part with his daughter, and claimed that he could still hear the howling of wolves at night. Orion grew angry and threatened to carry off the princess, but the king soothed him with honeyed words, sent for wine, and filled his cup so often that Orion drank too much and fell asleep. Stealthily, the evil king crept up and put out both his eyes. "Now see if you can carry off my daughter," he said. Blind and helpless, Orion left Chios and staggered over the seas in search of the sun, which he knew could restore his eyesight, but he could not find his way. From afar he heard the Cyclopes' hammers, and he followed the sound till he came to Hephaestus' forge on the island of Lemnos. The kind god took pity on him and lent him a Cyclops boy to show him the way to the east. With the Cyclops on his shoulders to see for him, Orion walked on till he met the rising sun. The sun let its healing rays play over Orion's blind eyes, and his sight was restored. Then he rushed back to seek revenge on the false king. But when he arrived, the palace was empty, for the king had seen his huge menacing shape against the sky and fled with his daughter. Again, Orion went hunting and soon forgot the king and the beautiful princess. My squeaky chair, sorry. He walked from island to island, and after a while he came to the island of Crete. There he met the goddess Artemis. She was glad to see him, for he could hunt as well as she, and was so very modest about it. Together they hunted wild goats and rejoiced in each other's company. Orion was the only man Artemis had ever favored, and her brother Apollo grew jealous. One day, while Artemis was away, he sent an enormous scorpion to attack Orion. Orion's club and mighty sword were no avail against the scorpion's poisonous tail. He turned to flee, but as he did, the giant insect, Arachnid, stung his heel. Artemis was angry with her brother when she returned and found her companion dead. But she could not stay angry with her twin for long, and he helped her hang Orion's image in the skies as a constellation, so the great hunter could never be forgotten. Here we go. Over the stormy winter sea, the constellation Orion glitters, enormous and menacing, and the dark clouds flee before him like wild animals. But in summer, when the constellation of the Scorpion rises over the horizon, Orion begins to sway and stagger, and then he in his turn flees and disappears into the ocean. Hermes, merriest of the Olympians, was the god of shepherds, travelers, merchants, thieves, and all others who lived by their wits. His mother, Maia, a Titan's daughter, lived in a cave on lofty Mount Selene, a cave so deep that Hera never knew that Maia was one of Zeus's wives. Maia had therefore borne her son Hermes in peace. Hermes was very precocious even for a god. His mother had hardly wrapped him and put him into a basket when he began to think of mischief. As soon as she had fallen asleep, he wriggled out of his wrappings and tiptoed out of the cave. In the dark of night, he toddled straight to the pasture where Apollo kept a large herd of white cows. To keep Apollo from knowing who had stolen it, Apollo liked music better than cows, and he did not even notice that Hermes stole into the pasture and picked out the 50 best cows. To keep Apollo from knowing who had stolen his herd and which way they had been driven, Hermes slyly wrapped the hooves of the cows in bark to disguise their prints. See there? And tied brooms to their tails so they would erase their own tracks. To confuse Apollo even further, he drove the cows backward out of the pasture and tied bundles of branches to his own little feet, so it looked as if a giant had led something into the pasture but nothing out. He hurried home to Mount Selene and hid the stolen cows in a grove. 2 of them he sacrificed to the 12 Olympian gods, and not forgetting to include himself as the 12th. Then he took the entrails of the sacrificed cows, made 7 strings of them, and strung them tautly across an empty tortoise shell. When he plucked the strings, they made lovely music. He had invented the first lyre. Pleased with himself, he hid the lyre under his arm and tiptoed back into the cave. He climbed into the basket, closed his eyes, and pretended to be sound asleep. But he did not fool his mother. She knew what he had been up to. "Shame on you," she said, sneaking out at night and stealing Apollo's cows. "Why, mother," said Hermes, "I did what I'd had to do for you and me. We don't want to live in this dark cave forever. Soon I will be seated on high Olympus as one of the 12 great gods, and you too will live there in glory as my mother." Then he pulled out his lyre and played his mother to sleep with a lullaby. At dawn, Apollo stormed into the cave where Hermes lay in his basket, pretending to be asleep. But Apollo wasn't fooled. An oracle had told him who had stolen his herd, and he jerked little Hermes out of his crib and commanded him to return the cows at once. "How could I have stolen your cows?" Hermes whimpered. "I am only a newborn babe. I don't even know what a cow is. Look for yourself, and you can see that there is not a single cow hidden in this cave." "You are not only a thief, but a liar as well," raged Apollo, and chased Hermes out of the cave and straight up to Olympus. All the gods burst out laughing when they saw innocent-looking little Hermes running with furious Apollo at his heels. "Tell this thief and liar to give me back my cows at once," said Apollo to their father Zeus. "Tell my big brother to stop bullying me. I am a newborn and helpless infant, and I am not a liar," said Hermes. "There isn't a cow in my mother's cave." "If they are not in the cave, then show Apollo where they are," said Zeus, and hid a smile in his beard. He was proud of both his sons and wanted them to be friends. Hermes had to obey his father, and without any more tricks he led his brother to the woods where the cows were hidden. Apollo forgave him, but when he counted his cows and found that two were missing, his anger flared again. Hermes had expected this and quickly pulled out his lyre and began to play. Apollo listened spellbound to the beautiful sounds from the new musical instrument, and he quite forgot his anger. As the god of music, he must have the lyre, and he offered Hermes his whole herd in exchange for the instrument. Hermes strode a hard bargain, and Apollo had to give him his magic wand as well. From then on, the two brothers were the best of friends. Never again did Hermes steal, though he was the god of thieves. He never told a lie, but he didn't always tell the whole truth. His mother Maia had no further reasons to be ashamed of him. As the mother of one of the 12 great Olympians, she moved up with him to the glory of Olympus. Zeus was so delighted with Hermes' ready wit that he made him the herald of the gods. He gave him a golden hat with wings, a pair of winged sandals, and a cape under which he could hide his magic tricks. In a flash he could move from place to place. He put glib words on the tongues of politicians and helped merchants close good bargains. Even Hera was fond of him. She had been really angry with him only once, and that was when he had killed her 100-eyed servant Argus. Then she was so furious that she demanded he be punished and called all the great and minor gods to sit in council and judge him. Each god was given a pebble and told to cast his vote according to the decision. Those who found Hermes guilty of a crime were to throw their pebbles at Hera's feet. Those who found him innocent were to throw their pebbles at his feet. Hermes walked tall in his own defense. Was it a crime to bore someone to death, he asked. After all, that was what he had done to Argus. The gods applauded, and so many threw their votes to Hermes that he was completely buried in a heap of pebbles. Ever after, travelers put up piles of stones along the roads, and they have believed that Hermes stands inside, helping them find their way. These were the first cairns. Hermes also guided those who set off on their last voyage. He touched the eyes of a dying man with his magic wand and led them down to Hades in the underworld. Hades, Lord of the Dead, was a gloomy god of few words. Mortals feared him so much that they did not dare mention his name, for they might attract his attention and he might send for them. Instead of Hades, they called him the Rich One, and indeed rich he was. All the treasures in the ground belonged to him. They also called him the Hospitable One, for in his desolate underground realm he always had room for another dead soul. Hermes guided the souls of the dead down to the brink of the river Styx, a murky, stagnant river that flowed around the underworld. There Hermes left them in charge of the ferryman, Charon. If they had money to pay for their fare, Charon sent them across. If not, he refused to take them, for he was greedy. Those who could not pay had to wander about till they found the pauper's entrance to Hades. That is why when a man died, his kin put a coin under his tongue. Sooner or later, all mortals came to Hades. Once inside his realm, they whirled about forever like dry leaves in a cold autumn wind. Cerberus, the three-headed watchdog of the underworld, stood at the gates. He let the dead souls enter, but once past his gnashing teeth and spiked tail, they could never go out again. Hades lived in a dark and gloomy palace with his ice-cold queen Persephone. She was beautiful, but as silent and somber as her husband, for she wasn't happy. She had not come to rule the joyless underworld of her own free will. She had been kidnapped by Hades. Persephone grew up on Olympus, and her gay laughter rang through the brilliant halls. She was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, and her mother loved her so dearly she could not bear to have her out of her sight. When Demeter sat on her golden throne, her daughter was always on her lap. When she went down to earth to look after her trees and fields, she took Persephone. Whenever Persephone danced on her light feet, flowers sprang up. She was so lovely and full of grace that even Hades, who saw so little, noticed her and fell in love with her. He wanted her for his queen, but he knew that her mother would never consent to part with her, so he decided to carry her off. One day, as Persephone ran about in the meadow gathering flowers, she strayed away from her mother and the attending nymphs. Suddenly the ground split open, and up from the yawning crevice came a dark chariot drawn by black horses. At the reins stood grim Hades. He seized the terrified girl, turned his horses, and plunged back into the ground. A herd of pigs rooting in the meadow tumbled into the cleft, and Persephone's cries for help died out as the ground closed again as suddenly as it had opened up. Up in the field, a little swineherd stood and wept over the pigs he had lost, while Demeter rushed wildly about in the meadow, looking in vain for her daughter, who had vanished without leaving a trace. With the frightened girl in his arms, Hades raced his snorting horses down away from the sunlit world. Down and down they sped on the dark path to his dismal underground palace. He led weeping Persephone in, seated her beside him in a throne of black marble, and decked her with gold and precious stones. But the jewels brought her no joy. She wanted no cold stones. She longed for warm sunshine and flowers and her golden-tressed mother. Dead souls crowded out from cracks and crevices to look at their new queen, while ever more souls came across the Styx, and Persephone watched them drink from a spring under dark poplars. It was the spring of Lethe, and those who drank from its waters forgot who they were and what they had done on earth. Rhadamanthus, a judge of the dead, dealt out punishment to the souls of great sinners. They were sentenced to suffer forever under the whips of the avenging Erinyes. Heroes were led to the Elysian fields, where they lived happily forever in the never-failing light. Around the palace of Hades there was a garden where whispering poplars and weeping willows grew. They had no flowers and bore no fruit, and no birds sang in their branches. There was only one tree in the whole realm of Hades that bore fruit. That was a little pomegranate tree. The gardener of the underworld offered the tempting pomegranates to the queen, but Persephone refused to touch the food of the dead. Wordlessly she walked through the garden at silent Hades' side, and slowly her heart turned to ice. Above on earth, Demeter ran about searching for her lost daughter, and all nature grieved with her. Flowers wilted, trees lost their leaves, and the fields grew barren and cold. In vain did the plow cut through the icy ground. Nothing could sprout, and nothing could grow, while the goddess of the harvest wept. People and animals starved, and the gods begged Demeter again to bless the earth, but she refused to let anything grow until she had found her daughter. Bent with grief, Demeter turned into a gray old woman. She returned to the meadow where Persephone had vanished and asked the sun if he had seen what had happened, but he said no. Dark clouds had hidden his face that day. She wandered around the meadow, and after a while she met a youth whose name was Triptolemus. He told her that his brother, a swineherd, had seen his pigs disappear into the ground and had heard the frightened screams of a girl. Demeter now understood that Hades had kidnapped her daughter, and her grief turned to anger. She called to Zeus and said that she would never again make the earth green if he did not command Hades to return Persephone. Zeus could not let the world perish, and he sent Hermes down to Hades, bidding him to let Persephone go. Even Hades had to obey the orders of Zeus, and sadly he said farewell to his queen. Joyfully Persephone leaped to her feet, but as she was leaving with Hermes, a hooting laugh came from the garden. There stood the gardener of Hades, grinning. He pointed to a pomegranate, from which a few of the kernels were missing. Persephone, lost in thought, had eaten the seeds, he said. Then dark Hades smiled. He watched Hermes lead Persephone up to the bright world above. He knew that she must return to him, for she had tasted the food of the dead. When Persephone again appeared on earth, Demeter sprang to her feet with a cry of joy and rushed to greet her daughter. No longer was she a sad old woman, but a radiant goddess. Again she blessed her fields, and the flowers bloomed anew, and the grain ripened. "Dear child," she said, "never again shall we be parted. Together we shall make all nature bloom." But joy soon changed to sadness, for Persephone had to admit that she had tasted the food of the dead and must return to Hades. However, Zeus decided that mother and daughter should not be parted forever. He ruled that Persephone had to return to Hades and spend 1 month in the underworld for each seed she had eaten. Every year when Persephone left her, Demeter grieved. Nothing grew, and there was winter on earth. But as soon as her daughter's light footsteps were heard, the whole earth burst into bloom. Spring had come. As long as mother and daughter were together, the earth was warm and bore fruit. Demeter was a kind goddess. She did not want mankind to starve during the cold months of winter when Persephone was away. She lent her chariot laden with grain to Triptolemus, the youth who had helped her to find her lost daughter. She told him to scatter her golden grain over the world and teach men how to sow it in spring and reap it in the fall, and store it away for the long months when again the earth was barren and cold. That's the end. Oh no, we've got one more god. Dionysus, the god of wine, was the youngest of the Olympians. He was the only one of the 12 great gods whose mother was immortal. His father was Zeus himself. Jealous Hera hated his mother, the beautiful princess Semele, and one day when Zeus was away, the goddess disguised herself as an old crone and went to visit her. She talked about this and about that, pretending to be very friendly, and when she asked why Semele's husband was not at home, what kind of man he might be. "He is nobody less than mighty Zeus," Semele said proudly. "How can you be so sure about that?" said the old woman. "I know many husbands who claim to be the lord of all creation. Do you have proof that he really is who he says he is? If I were you, I would ask him to show himself in all his splendor." Then she went away, and Semele was left alone, wondering. When Zeus returned, Semele asked him to grant her a wish. Zeus, who loved her dearly, swore by the river Styx to fulfill any wish she might have. "Then show yourself in all your splendor," said Semele. Zeus begged her to change her wish, for he knew that no mortal eyes could bear the sight of him when he revealed himself as the flashing thunder god, 100 times brighter than the sun. But Hera had planted the seed of suspicion so deep in Semele's heart that she refused to change her wish. Zeus had to keep his promise, for he had sworn by the river Styx, the most solemn oath of the gods. He joined together the smallest storm clouds he could find, chose his tiniest lightning bolt, and showed himself to Semele as the mighty thunder god. Even so, he was so brilliant that Semele caught fire and burned to cinders. Zeus could do nothing to save her. She went down to Hades as a fluttering ghost. Zeus barely managed to rescue her unborn son and sewed him under the skin of his own leg, and when the child was ready to be born, he sprang forth as the immortal god Dionysus. Zeus knew well enough who was the cause of Semele's death, and he gave her little son to Hermes and told him to hide the boy from Hera. Hermes carried Dionysus to the faraway valley of Nysa and left him in the care of a band of Maenads, the nymphs of the valley. There Dionysus grew up with tigers and leopards for playmates. Large bunches of purple grapes grew on the sunny slope of the valley of Nysa, and in time Dionysus invented the making of wine from their juice. As a young and beautiful god dressed in flowing robes of royal purple, he went out into the world to teach men how to make wine. The Maenads went with him, and so did the leopards and tigers, and ever more followers joined him. Wherever he went, he was worshipped as a new god, and his father Zeus watched him with pleasure. Dionysus returned to Greece and traveled from island to island, teaching the making of wine. One day, as he was sleeping alone on a beach, a pirate ship sailed by. When the pirates saw the richly clad youth, they thought he was a prince and carried him off on their ship to hold him for ransom. He did not wake from his heavy slumber till the ship was far out at sea. With gentle words, he tried to persuade the pirates to take him back. He was not a prince, he said. He was the god of wine, and his riches were not of this world. The pirates laughed scornfully and sailed on, paying him no heed. Suddenly their laughter died, for out of the sea sprouted vines loaded with grapes. They grew, twining around the oars, winding up the mast, and spreading over the whole ship as if it were an arbor. Blood-red wine dripped down the sail, and the air was filled with the sound of roaring tigers and braying asses. Dionysus himself seemed to grow till he filled the ship with his glory. Horrified, the sailors threw themselves into the sea. But they did not drown, for Dionysus was a kind god. He changed them into dolphins, and that is why dolphins are the most human of all creatures that live in the ocean. That's it. Oh, last page. Right? Yeah, that's the last page. Here we go. Look at this awesome picture. Dionysus had brought much joy to mankind, and Zeus decided that the time had come to give him a golden throne on Olympus. Hera rose in anger and said she refused to share the hall with the son of a mortal woman, but Zeus pounded his indomitable fist, and Hera sat silent. There were only 12 thrones in the hall, so kind Hestia quietly rose from hers and said that Dionysus could have it. Her place was at the hearth, she said. She needed no throne. Before seating himself on his throne, Dionysus asked to see his mother, for whom he had always longed. Zeus not only permitted him to see her, but let him go down to Hades and bring her up to the glory of Olympus, for she was now the mother of one of the great gods. Happily, Dionysus entered the hall and seated himself on his golden throne. The air was filled with the music of flutes and tambourines. Never had there been such a din and merriment on Olympus. Zeus looked around with great content and beckoned to his cupbearer Ganymede, bidding him to fill the golden goblets with sweet nectar. And that's the end of our story about the gods. So, like I said, there's lots and lots and lots of other awesome Greek stories